This is the Behavioral Observations Podcast with Matt Sikoria, session number 15.
Welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now, here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
Hey everyone, it's Matt Sikoria here. I'm really happy to be back with you in episode 15 of the Behavioral Observations Podcast. And today is an extra special episode because I've got an extra special guest. Instead of talking to a behavior analyst this week, I have brought on a guest who is not one of us. And the person we'll be hearing from in this session of the Behavioral Observations Podcast is named Rich Brooks. And Rich is the chief cook and bottle washer of Flight New Media, which is a web design and digital marketing company out of Portland, Maine. And I met Rich a little while back at the annual conference that he holds in Portland called the Agents of Change Conference. And it's all about, it's all things digital marketing. So there were tons of podcasters, bloggers, people selling digital products, and even many people there with brick and mortar stores and facilities and other sorts of business enterprises. And it was a real eye-opening event for me because it's the first kind of non-scientific conference I've ever been to. And so it was really interesting because the level of the extrovert to introvert ratio was tilted towards the former big time. And so I must have collected about a couple dozen business cards throughout the day. Very, very different than ABAI or some of the other conferences that we go to. But again, it was fun. And one of the things that really stuck out to me was the midday keynote address that Rich gave. And he talked all about how to find how people can find you on the internet and things like that, and not find you in a bad way, of course. What I'm talking about is how referrals sources can find your agency or your practice or what have you, and what are some best practices for being found. What are some do's and don'ts? And so it sounded like a perfect person to bring on the podcast because, as anyone who's been around for a little while has observed, our practice is maturing. Now, we're still in our adolescence, as Jim Carr likes to say, but we're maturing nonetheless. And so as the profession continues to professionalize and we start to, start to resemble other types of more mature helping professions like, say, people who do, what we consider, conventional therapy or, speech language pathologists or, other types of allied health professionals, we're going to need to differentiate ourselves and market ourselves in such a way to continue to receive referrals. I know that seems like a crazy idea right now because there's such a need for behavior analytics services, but with the rate of people passing the behavior analysis exam, we're going to probably have to compete with one another as things move forward. And so Rich is on the podcast today to talk about, how from a search perspective, how we can, become noticeable on the, as we market ourselves with our websites. And we talk a little bit about social media and, just some general best practices. I think it's fun to have someone from outside the field to provide a different perspective on these sorts of matters, particularly since, quite frankly, this is something that we don't get trained in. We don't go to school to learn how to run businesses. We don't go to school to learn how to market services and things like that. So, it's a good object lesson in terms of, how do we want to spend our time? In other words, if we can find people to help us with these sorts of things, we can spend more time doing the things we're actually trained to do. So, we talk about, how to be a good client if you're looking for web development services, but we also recognize that, many of us starting out may not necessarily have the budget for that sort of thing. And so we talk about some do-it-yourself methods and from a website development perspective. So, and we kind of go all over the map. So I hope you enjoy this kind of wide-ranging discussion with Rich Brooks. And after we conclude our interview, I'll have some closing thoughts on marketing as it relates to the lessons I've learned as a behavior analyst over the years. Before we get to the interview, however, I do want to let you know that this interview is sponsored by bside21.org, and in particular their ABA Outside the Box training series. So we all need continuing education, of course, and they have a really convenient way to get that. The event that I participated in was called Conversations That Drive Performance, and it was all about how to have those uncomfortable conversations when you have to provide some feedback to someone or things like that. It was done by Dr. Scott Herbst, and I think you'll enjoy it. That's bside21.org/CEUS. And then real quickly, I want to give special thanks to Drs. Becca Tagg and Marie Miller for helping me prepare for this interview. So without any further ado, please enjoy this conversation with Rich Brooks. Hey, Rich Brooks, thanks for coming along the Behavioral Observations podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Matt. Thanks for having me.
Oh, the pleasure's mine. You have the distinct honor of being the first non-behavior analyst or non-psychologist to be on the show. So
my dad's a psychologist. Does that count?
Yeah, I was related to one. Yeah, that's like the Holiday Inn joke. But yeah, that does count, or it's close enough for our purposes. I wanted to have you on today because I met you at the Agents of Change conference, which was all about digital marketing and all sorts of stuff like that. And you gave a really interesting talk that I thought would be really relevant for people in my audience. So, I have a lot of questions about websites and marketing and all this sort of thing. The field of behavior analysis is kind of in its infancy, or at least adolescence. And so it's poised for pretty explosive growth over the next several years. And it's also transitioning into more or less a practice-oriented field, similar to other types of medical professions and things along those lines. And so we need to start looking at marketing from a professional angle. And what happens a lot is most of us go to school to become behavior analysts and not necessarily marketers, web designers, etc. So long story short, I thought you'd be the perfect guest to come on and talk to us a lot about these sorts of issues. So before we get into some specific questions I have, I'd like to give you an opportunity to kind of introduce yourself to the audience, tell us about what you do and kind of what brought that to where you are now.
Sure thing. I guess there's two main brands that I manage. One is called Flight New Media. That's my day job. We are a digital agency located in Portland, Maine. And what that means is we design and build websites for people and companies. And then we help market those websites with search, social, mobile marketing, anything delivered digitally. And then I also have this brand called, as you mentioned it earlier, the Agents of Change. And the Agents of Change started as a digital marketing conference. I was going to events like Blog World and New Media Expo and Social Media Marketing World. And they were these great big conferences all over the country, but I didn't really find anything like that in Maine. And so I wanted to bring a flavor of that to Maine. I wanted to bring some of the great experts that I had met along my way to the state and kind of share some of their knowledge with everybody else. So it started as a conference, and then I also started a podcast, which originally was called The Marketing Agents. And then I realized that there was just too many brands I had, and really they were all saying the same thing. So I renamed my podcast to be the Agents of Change podcast, because we're talking about a lot of the same things. How do you reach more of your ideal clients through search, social, and mobile marketing? So those are really the two brands that I manage right now. The Agents of Change is really focused on the do-it-yourselfer, the digital marketer who is looking for advice and help, but really wants to kind of do it on their own, at least to start with. And of course, the agency, Flight New Media, is more about when you're looking to hire somebody, you want a partner, you want something built, you want to outsource it. That's the time where we've got an agency where we're able to help you.
Great. So we will kind of talk about perhaps both of those angles, the kind of DIY and the more or less multi or full service model in a little bit. But before we get there, What are some, and you had a great podcast episode, and I will link to that episode in the show notes, but you had a great episode recently about, some must-haves for websites. And so as a lot of us behavior analysts are starting our practices or maybe taking a second look at our, web portfolios, et cetera, and perhaps thinking about revising them, what are some essential elements for anyone's website, whether they're a behavior analyst or a psychologist like your dad or anyone else for that matter in business?
That's a great question. And it's interesting because I'm coming up on my 20th year of doing this. And it is funny because you were mentioning that you guys are kind of shifting to this practice-oriented field. And I remember getting my dad on the web years and years ago when very few, if any, psychologists had websites. And it was a little bit ahead of the curve on that one. He just kept on letting me do that because I think he was afraid that if I failed, I'd probably move back home. Right. So he kept on letting me redo his website whenever I needed to. There are a number of things I've learned over the last 20 years that are true for every business. And I actually have this model at Flight called the BEAR Essentials of Digital Marketing. And BEAR is an acronym, and it stands for, or it's BARE, and it's build, attract, retain, and evaluate. So the build part is really more on the website side of things. We all need websites these days. I mean, if you're getting any business, and one of the things that I've seen shift first in psychology and now I think in your field is that a lot more of the end users are making the buying decisions. And I've seen this in a lot of different fields where it used to be like, oh, you'd get all your referrals from the hospital or from the school or wherever it was, and you never really had to go out and market yourself. And now that's changing, especially with websites being everywhere, being ubiquitous, people able to access information and even make a judgment, like maybe they get 2 or 3 names of here's some people you can work with. They're going to go to the website. They're going to do the research. They'll also maybe ask for friends and ask for referrals, but they're going to go to your website. So the first thing is you need to have a website. And you need to have control of your domain. In other words, you don't want to have a website at mypractice.wix.com or mypractice.wordpress.com. You want to own your domain name. So that way, if you ever need to move it, change it, switch to another platform, you'll be in control. Google is looking at that domain name kind of as a place where you're building trust. Mm-hmm. I personally feel that you should build your website on a content management system or a CMS. And really that just means that you're able to make most of the changes yourself. So if you've got a group practice and you want to add somebody, or if you've got a new article you want to share or anything like that, you don't have to go back to your web developer and ask him or her to make those changes for you. Mm-hmm. It's also critically important that you're on a mobile-friendly platform. And that is such a big deal these days. Mainly because more than half of the world's internet traffic is delivered to a mobile device. That's a big one. Now, admittedly, in the U.S., that's not the case. The bottom line is we spend almost all day on our desktop computers. We've got desktop computers or laptops at home, at the office, wherever we go. So the numbers aren't quite so important in the U.S., but Google is taking a mobile-first approach to search engine optimization. So if you want to rank well at Google, you need to have a mobile-friendly website. Those are some of the bottom line things that you just need to make sure you do as you move forward into building your own website or having one built for you.
Great. Can you just take a second? You mentioned the CMS. Can you give an example of what that would be? I mean, I'm a little bit familiar with this because I put together my own website with some help with some friends, but not necessarily professionally done, as most visitors will be able to figure out pretty quickly. But
sure.
If we're talking about like something like WordPress or something like that, can you just talk about what that might mean to folks who haven't kind of dipped their toe into these waters?
Sure. WordPress is a perfect example. We're actually a WordPress agency, so everything we build is on WordPress. WordPress now powers over 25% of the world's websites, so it's certainly a very popular choice. It is a free choice in terms of the software itself is free. Now, of course, if you're working with an outside agency, designer, developer, they're going to charge you for their time. But the bottom line is the software itself is free. Mm-hmm. So that's one really good option. That's my personal favorite because I find it so easy to use. But there are other tools out there. Joomla and Drupal are 2 other popular content management systems that are open source like WordPress. So those are similar. My personal experience with this is WordPress is so much easier to pick up as an end user than either of those two other options.
Mm-hmm.
And then on the paid side, you're looking at platforms like Wix, W-I-X, or Squarespace is another one, or HubSpot, and they vary in price. And basically, it's software as a service, also known as SaaS, and you are paying a monthly fee for having your website out there on their software. The good thing about that is if you really just don't want to manage any of this yourself, you can often get a templated website through any one of those services and then continue to improve on it. The downside is you're kind of stuck with their platform, and it's not easy to move from one to another. So you're basically reinventing the wheel every time. If you do decide like HubSpot is too expensive or Wix is too basic or whatever the case is, but then again, you might end up staying there and you'd be perfectly happy.
I see. So in other words, what would happen, I guess, let me phrase it as a question. What would happen if you started something on, say, Squarespace, and Squarespace went under or got bought out by something like that? Would you be starting from scratch?
You would be. And Squarespace seems to be a very good company that a lot of people like. I have no belief that it's going to go out of business soon.
Oh, yeah. I'm not asking that question based on the premonition.
Specifically, right. But in terms of, I've seen this happen before where people choose a platform, and that platform either becomes irrelevant because just not enough people are on it. So the developers move to another platform and suddenly you're stuck with something that looks like it was built in the 1980s. And so at a certain point, you need to jump ship and rebuild on another website. Now, your images can stay the same, your content can stay the same, but you are going to have to rebuild onto another platform. That being said, having been in this industry for so long, I think the average length of a website before you really want to throw a hand grenade in the middle of it is 5 years. So even if you're on WordPress and you love it and you decide, hey, I'm going to stick with this platform because I'm really growing with it, I understand it, that doesn't mean that you should keep it forever because things continually do change. 5 years ago, mobile was just a very emerging trend where now I think it is a requirement of every website out there today.
I see. One of the things when we were chatting on the phone the other day, setting this interview up, we were talking about the different ways in which people market services, and one of the, I think, challenges of having kind of a consistent type of, consistent, I guess, is one way to think about it, a type of marketing strategy is so many of us behavior analysts provide services in different ways and get clients in different ways. And one of the ways in which the field is changing is that a lot of services for a long time were delivered either in in-home settings and in schools, and that still is very much the case. But a lot of behavior analysts now are starting their own clinics, and so the field is kind of evolving towards a model where more and more people are going to be served in what we would call in the business world kind of brick and mortar locations. So, are there any considerations as it relates to differences in what needs to be on your website from someone who does all their work offsite in a consultation type of model versus a brick and mortar type of setting?
Sure. I think that one important thing is that when you think about a Google search result page, and I know there are many search engines, but let's be honest, we all use Google.
Of course.
When you do a search on Google, there's 3 places where results may appear. And now that Google has moved to a single column approach, meaning that everything is in one column with very few exceptions, here's what you get. If there is any paid ads, they're going to appear at the top of the page. Underneath that will be the local search results, and underneath that will be what are considered the organic search results, which used to be what Google was made up of. But now it's been relegated almost to third place. So if I were in this world and I was marketing my practice, one of the first things that I would do is I would make sure that I had optimized for what's called local search. And if you do a search, let's say pizza or bagel or whatever it is, a lot of times Google is like, well, that person probably doesn't want to learn how to make pizza. They're probably looking for a pizza parlor. So here's a Google map, and it's got 3 dots on it. And then we're going to list those 3 places based on where we think this person is right now. And then you could always click to see more. But the bottom line is nobody clicks to see more. Chances are those 3 results are perfectly fine. If I'm in your world, and I've got a brick and mortar place and somebody's doing a Google search, I want to make sure that I'm one of those 3. So I'm going to focus a lot on my local SEO results. And what that means for me from a marketing standpoint is I need to be consistent with what's called my NAP information, name, address, and phone. So that means that on every page of my website, I'm going to list my name, my address, and my phone number consistently, which means, and this sounds crazy, but if you abbreviate the word street, ST period, in one place, then you have to do the same everywhere. And it's not just on your website. You also need to make sure that any online directories are also listing your information in the exact same way, because if they don't, even a period could change it. Then a lot of times what happens is you get duplicate results, and that actually kind of dilutes your brand online, and you may not appear because people are paying attention to different signals out there. And one tool that you can use to see how you're doing is a tool called Moz, M-O-Z. You go to moz.com, there's a local search tool there, and it'll just give you a rating on how well optimized your particular business is for local SEO.
So I've got two questions based on that. One is does it matter whether you spell out street or not, or is it just the point of just being consistent?
Consistency, okay, I think, is the key piece. I haven't seen anything that says one is better than the other.
Okay. And then secondly, can you, in lay terms, kind of describe what SEO means to the average person, Google user?
Sure. So SEO is short for search engine optimization, and it's basically the art and science of outranking your competition. And as I mentioned before, there are 3 places on a Google search results. 2 of them are really about SEO, search engine optimization. One, the local section, which we just talked about. The other is the organic section, which there's a lot of variables to that. But really what it means is, how well does your website answer the question that somebody just asked Google? That's part of it. Like, in other words, are the words that they just asked, are they appearing on your website in appropriate places? And also, do you have a lot of quality incoming links? When people link to your website, that actually is a signal to Google that you must be doing something right. Now, it's a lot more nuanced than that, but getting quality incoming links to your website is definitely important in terms of getting more visibility in Google. And there's a number of tactics that you can take to improve your visibility as well. And I'm happy, or to improve the number of incoming links you get as well. I'm happy to talk about that if you want to go down that road.
Yeah, I think you kind of piqued everyone's curiosity. So if you can give us like a couple of quick examples about that. And so the idea behind that, just to kind of make sure I'm translating here, because this is far from my area of expertise, but incoming links is just other people putting some sort of link on their website, or I don't know, or
blog or directory. Social media probably has the least impact when it comes to that. It's a signal to Google if a lot of people are mentioning you in social media, and Google is supposedly moving away from just paying attention to links, but it is an important piece.
Okay.
So some of what I would do if I was in especially if I'm just starting out, whether I'm just starting out on the web or I'm just starting out in practice, is I would try to establish myself as an experienced, credible resource. So I would be creating content. And by content, I probably mean a blog. I would try and write a blog post once a week, once every other week. Doesn't have to be long, 300 to 500 words, that talk about some of the things that I see, as long as I'm, not mentioning anybody by name.
Sure.
But, you could start with some of the questions that you get on a regular basis, your frequently asked questions. Turn those into a Dear Abby style post. I do the same with email marketing. Rich, even if I have to make up the people, or often I'll just generalize an email I got. Rich, my email list is pretty small. How do I grow it? So then I'll answer that question in a blog post, because that's probably the same kind of question somebody, or hundreds of people, or tens of thousands of people are asking at Google. So you might consider, like, what kind of questions are your ideal patients or referrers or family members asking of Google, and can you answer those in a blog? That's going to do a couple things. It's going to put the best, you're going to be using the language of your customer or your patient, and using it on your website, which is going to help you with on-page optimization. And at the same time, if you start to become a resource for these sort of things, other people may link to you to talk about the things that you're talking about, and those natural forming incoming links are also going to give you a boost. You can also get a little bit more aggressive with your link building techniques. You can find other related websites and blogs that might be looking for articles and write articles for them. And usually you don't get paid for these articles, but you do get links back from their website to your website, which again, in Google's mind says, this must be valuable content. I'm going to increase the visibility of this particular website.
I see.
Again, this is a little bit simplified, but you get the idea.
Oh, no. I think that example of turning an commonly asked questions into blog posts, that resonates with probably every behavior analyst, because there are usually just a series of things that we go through every day that we that are commonly encountered scenarios or commonly encountered issues that families or clients or therapists and teachers that we work with are encountering. So that's a great example.
And I would just say it's just the modern version of publish or perish.
Yeah. Well, our field is grounded in the academic arena, so I'm sure there are also some behavior analysts who are in academia who can resonate with that phrase as well. So I want to change gears here a little bit and talk a little bit about branding, because that's something, again, as I've mentioned earlier, none of us really go to school to run a business. None of us go to school to learn how to, develop a WordPress site or, do SEO or any of these sorts of things. And marketing is oftentimes, could be put in the same category. So when it comes to branding, if there's someone out there, and there are many behavior analysts out there who are contemplating starting their own practice or doing some sort of endeavor that requires some marketing, do you have any just kind of general advice for developing a brand, if you will? Not to use the term so generically, but it's obviously something that's important.
Yeah, well, and of course there's corporate branding and then there's personal branding as well. So, if you were thinking about creating because really what we're talking about now is entrepreneurship. I mean, the bottom line is it's a practice, but you're creating something. You're undertaking something, and that is entrepreneurship. And I'm a big fan of branding, because there are probably a lot of behavior analysts out there who you are quote unquote competing with. And if you can separate yourself and make yourself recognizable, and as long as your brand is good and seen in a positive light, you're more likely to get business, because we all use shortcuts. We all use shortcuts to make decisions. And if somebody has heard your name, and as long as it's not in a negative light, they're going to start to associate you. Oh, I keep on hearing about this person. I've read his emails. I've seen his blog posts. I've heard his podcast. I saw her on TV. Whatever the case may be, is that puts you in a positive light. You're more likely to get those referrals. So I think just, some of the key tenets of branding would be is consistency. So, always using similar fonts, similar design. And this might be something where you just talk to a local graphic designer. Part of it could be a logo, but it definitely goes further than just having a logo. It's using making sure that all your stuff looks similar. If you're the person writing, it's about developing your voice so that people come to know to expect things like, if people read my stuff, they'll find that I'm pretty irreverent, which is odd because I feel like I've been kind of straight-laced in this interview. But if you read my stuff, like I'll have random asides and things like that in there. And I think I've heard from people that they like my writing because of that. So I think there's a lot of that out there. Also, if you're thinking about personal branding, like maybe you're not ready to open your own practice, but you're working somewhere else, there's no downside to starting a blog and developing your own personal brand, because you become kind of a magnet. There's a certain amount of gravity when you're creating valuable content that your end user enjoys or learns from. That's powerful. And those are the kind of things where one thing leads to another. I one time blogged about podcasting before I even got started on podcasting. And I got an email from Inc. magazine saying, "We understand you're a podcasting expert. We're wondering if we can interview you." And I was like, absolutely I can, but not today. Can we talk on Friday, 2 days from then? They're like, absolutely. So anyways, I immediately went out to the bookstore, bought 2 books on podcasting, read them cover to cover. And then Inc. magazine called me that Friday, and I was the expert on podcasting, and I got into Inc. magazine, which for me was like being written into the Holy Bible. So, just in terms of creating this content allows you to brand yourself. And that brand is a brand of expertise, and people feel confident about your brand. And so they're more likely to choose you than somebody who isn't really thinking about how they're being seen in the community.
I see. That's a a good perspective on that. And let's. So one of the things I want to do is kind of tie some of this as we're talking about, kind of digital marketing, things like that. Where does we mentioned social media earlier, and so where does social media kind of come into play here, and what are some effective practices that you've seen from your point of view?
Good question. Now, of course, you're dealing with a lot more regulations than I am. There's no real regulations on a digital marketer using social media.
Sure,
in the way
sure.
that you guys may be dealing with HIPAA requirements and other things,
We
other
have,
acronyms I don't even know about.
Yeah, and we also have a lot of ethical considerations as it relates to not just social media specifically, but just marketing materials in general. In terms of we have to be very careful and about avoiding testimonials and other sorts of things. So yes, we have a kind of we have to be careful and mindful about how we do this. But some general advice and observations from you would be certainly well received. So.
All right, so I'll just speak from the heart, and then you can slap my hand if I say it's going to get your listeners into trouble. So, this is how I view social media, is that there's two main categories: platforms and networking. So platforms are places, imagine a soapbox where you can stand on your soapbox, say what you want to share with the world, and then there might be some feedback. And years ago, I spent a semester in London, and every Sunday in Hyde Park, there's a place called Speaker's Corner where people literally get on soapboxes, or sometimes upside down milk crates, and they speak on any subject they want, and people gather around them and they shout things back. And it almost is like a real life blog with comments. So one aspect of social media that I think is going to be more relevant for your listeners is going to be the platform side. And then there's the networking side. And the networking side tends to be more things like Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest, Instagram, LinkedIn. Very powerful tools for certain businesses, less powerful for others. So let's talk about the platform. I think that everybody who's listening, if you want to get into this, needs to think about what's the right platform for me. And what I generally tell people is if you're just getting started, pick one platform and one network and focus on those. Much better to go deep than wide. So for you, you found your enjoyment in creating podcasts, auditory listening. So a podcast is an excellent social platform. Blogging is an excellent social platform. I do both, but this is what I do. I love to write, so the blogging part comes easy, and I actually enjoy conversations with experts. So that's why I like the podcasting side of things. It's also less time consuming for me.
Yeah,
doesn't have the same SEO benefits seemingly as blog posts do, but it's okay. And then there's also YouTube is another good one. So, a lot of people might feel okay about getting on. And is there a piece of advice that you can give people on how to, I don't even know, but are there pieces of advice that you can give that are general, not specific to a client or patient that you can provide? And maybe it's a talking head style video where you're just speaking to the camera. Maybe it's some role playing that you do. Maybe there's some how-to videos you can create. You can probably get creative. And if you just go to YouTube and search on behavior analyst, I'm sure that you'll find some people who have already broken ground that you can take some lessons from.
Absolutely.
Some other platforms include things like SlideShare, which is owned by LinkedIn, and that's kind of like the YouTube of PowerPoint presentations. You can also do webinars, and people never think of webinars as social media, but I do because I think you can make them very interactive. And, depending on who you're trying to reach, putting on webinars could be a great way of getting in front of people. And so that's kind of the platform side of thing. And then there's the networking side of thing. And like I mentioned, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, so on and so forth. I think depending on the type of business you're looking to get or the type of patients you're looking to acquire, one may be better than the other. Facebook for me feels really very consumer facing. I don't know if that's where I'd spend my time. It might be more on Twitter or LinkedIn, depending on, again, who I'm trying to get in touch with.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm there are, just from my perspective, there seems to be a lot of specific Facebook groups for different topics in applied behavior analysis. So I've found that to be an effective way to communicate with different practitioners, and there might be a different platform that's better suited for marketing towards individuals and families who are looking for specific services. So, yeah, finding which one and finding where your people are hanging out, or your target, market, if you will, hangs out, is certainly important. So
that's definitely a critical piece. And like you mentioned, like I hadn't even thought about from the referral standpoint, finding some private or closed Facebook groups where people who might be in the position to refer business to you might make a lot of sense. So.
Yep. So I want to just kind of get back to the actual website discussion proper here. And one of the things I always try to think of is, when I'm trying to buy something, and, how can I be a good consumer of it? In other words, whether it's buying a car, or as we were talking about just before we record the show, I just bought a dishwasher, and so, in terms of doing research and how to be so when I go to the store, I know what questions to ask. I know what features to look for and things like that. That's just kind of how I consume, products and services and things like that. So let's take that from someone who is, say, coming to you, a web developer. Let's say I have a behavior analysis practice, and how can I be a good consumer? How can I know what good questions to ask? How can I make the most of an engagement with someone who is developing a website or some sort of digital marketing platform strategy, or whatever you want to call it?
Sure. And the relationship you have with your web design or your digital agency, I think, is like any other service industry. You have to feel like there's a good connection there. It does sometimes just come down to personality. Some of the things that I'd probably ask for are, have you worked, maybe it may be a little bit too niche to say, like, have you worked with other behavior analysts before and judge people on that? But have you worked with other mental health professionals or other health practitioners and see some examples of their work? You can certainly start by talking to your friends who may have had a website built and ask, did they have a good experience with their developer? And that's going to make a big difference. I would want to have a web agency ask me the right kind of questions. For me, that would be a big part of it, like asking about the goals. There's definitely different types of agencies, and some will basically be creating an online brochure for you. And that was fine in 1997, but it just doesn't cut the mustard anymore. So I'd want to make sure that, that it's being built on a content management system. I personally would want an open source content management system. What I mean by that is, for example, WordPress. Flight New Media doesn't own WordPress. If we design and build a website for you and you decide to take that to a different company for whatever reason, you can. You don't need to work with us anymore. If you hire a company that's developed its own content management system, you can't leave them. Basically, you have to recreate your website somewhere else, and so you're going to lose everything you built up to at that point. So that's problematic. I'd want to make sure that the developer has experience building mobile-friendly websites. I'd ask, does the agency also offer SEO services? Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. If they don't, and that's important to you to get found, then you're going to have to hire a second agency to handle that piece of it. That's not a wrong answer, but it's just something that you need to be aware of. So now you're working with two agencies that need to work hand in hand together. I'm a big fan of email marketing. I feel that one of the things that most practitioners and entrepreneurs and marketers don't spend enough time on is building an email list. And again, like with behavior analysts, you guys are limited by the number of hours you can spend with patients. So in my mind, I'm like, what other things can I be doing? Can I be writing a book? Can I be doing speaking gigs? Are there ways that I can kind of break through the limits that trading hours for dollars is going to make? And so then I'm going to look for other opportunities to reach a wider audience. And one of the best ways is an email list. So does this agency have experience with list building? So these are some of the questions that I would ask. I'd also want to make sure that, I'm in complete control of my website, that I have full ownership of it, that I can take it and leave whenever I want to. And I'd want to see examples of their work. I have Flight has a certain design aesthetic. If you don't like that design, then we're never going to satisfy you. And that's okay. You may like a specific color or a specific design scheme that we're just like, we don't feel comfortable building because we don't feel that represents how we like to or how we recommend building websites. So those can be some of the questions that I might want to ask. But in short, it has to be built on a mobile-friendly website. It has to be built on a content management system so you can do it yourself. And you really want to just feel comfortable with the skills of that agency. And hopefully they're asking you about what your goals are, because that really drives the website. A website is not an online brochure, at least not a good one. It should be a 24/7 sales and marketing team that's dedicated to bringing you more business so you can get back to focusing on why you became a behavior analyst in the first place, and so that you don't have to spend as much time doing marketing.
I see. Well, speaking of spending time not doing what we've been trained to do, what advice, if someone's going the DIY route, so if you want to do your own website, do you have any advice for someone taking that option?
It's definitely not in my wheelhouse, but if I were saying something, if I was going to go talk to somebody about this, I'd start with, where are your skills? Like, do you like going under the hood and looking at code, or do you not want to deal with that at all? If you don't mind getting your hands messy and you have that kind of like curious nature, then I might recommend going with a content management system like WordPress, where you're going to, maybe have to look under the hood occasionally. If you absolutely can't stand that, and you want to do it yourself still, I would probably look to something like Wix or Squarespace, where it's really kind of like you just type in your information and suddenly you have a website. But I will say this, that you get what you pay for. And if you're going to do it yourself, is this really what you got into business for? I need help with my taxes. I need help changing my tires. I need help changing my oil. So I outsource all those things so I can focus on what I do best. But if you are just getting started and you do not have the budget, I would look to a platform like Wix or Squarespace, at least as a starting point. I'd be writing all my own content. I'd be going to Adobe Stock Photo to buy some inexpensive photography that looks professional on my website. There's two places where people don't spend enough resources on their website. One is in the words that they use, the copy, and the other is in the photographs that they use. I think stock photography is fine, especially if you're just getting started, but you don't really want to cheap out on it. The only inexpensive website I've ever seen with good stock photography was bought out by Adobe, so now it's stock.adobe.com. I think it's like $30 a month for 10 images, which is $3 a photo, which is insanely cheap, and probably for the do-it-yourself are a perfect solution.
Cool. Well, Rich, this has been a very educational opportunity. I think there's a lot of behavior analysts out there that are now going to go look at their websites, or maybe you've inspired people to kind of create their own, or they may be calling up their developer and perhaps asking some more questions and things like that. So this has been a stimulating conversation. Before I let you go here, where can listeners find you if they have any questions?
Sure. Well, if you like podcasts and if you like marketing, I'd recommend that you check out our Agents of Change podcast, where we talk about a lot of these things. And the easiest way to get there is our website, theagentsofchange.com. And if you're looking for help and you want to talk through this with somebody, then I'd recommend you check out our business website at takeflight.com, and that's FLYTE.com. And if you just want to start a conversation, I love Twitter. And I am the Rich Brooks on Twitter and everywhere else on the internet, so it's not too hard to find me.
Great. Rich, thanks so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. I enjoyed it.
All right. Bye-bye. All right. That's some good stuff from Rich, and I hope you get a chance to say hello to him on Twitter and elsewhere. I want to depart from my usual routine of providing closing comments here and kind of extend the discussion a little bit about the lessons that I've learned in marketing services over the years, both just in a general way as well as from the perspective of developing a website and things like that. So one of the things I know it's such common sense to say, it starts with doing good work, and I know Rich already mentioned that, but man, word of mouth is such a huge mover of or driver of referrals. It can't be overstated enough. So obviously doing a good job and making sure the clients are receiving good services and are satisfied is huge. So whatever you can do perhaps to survey your clients to see to tell whether or not they are satisfied with your work, or figuring out ways to kind of maximize that or provide services that would enhance that client satisfaction. Those are going to result in there'll be a tangible return on investment in those strategies because, like I said, word of mouth is such a huge driver. I've seen it in my own practice, and certainly I've seen it with others. With regard to websites, uh, one of the things that if you're designing a website or looking to refresh your website, one of the things I learned about is a website should convey three things, and it should convey those things right away. In other words, it should take 5 seconds or less to figure these things out. And those things include the following: A, what services you offer; B, how those services will make the client's life better; and C, how to obtain those services. In other words, what are you selling? How is it going to make me better? And where can I get it? Or how can I get it? And of course, if we apply that to behavior analytic services, obviously we're talking about, services making if we're working with children with autism, we're talking about making the child's life better. And these things don't necessarily have to be conveyed in text. As a matter of fact, the more text, probably the less effective. These things can be very simply conveyed in images. So if you go to, say, a website like delmarbehavioralhealth.com, there's a picture of a happy child and parent on the front page of it, and that kind of conveys the image that they're trying to portray in terms of what sort of result those services might render. And so those are some things to keep in mind. There are a lot of things that we as behavior analysts really get into that families don't necessarily care that much about. So some things perhaps to avoid on your homepage, or at least to put them elsewhere on your website, is pictures of yourself, pictures of your clinic. People don't necessarily care. Lay people, I should say, don't necessarily care all that much where you went to school. They might care about the certifications that you have. Obviously, they want to know that you're a BCBA or a BCBA-D or whatever credential you have. But they may be more interested in things like, the hours, the type of insurance plans you accept, where you're located, some unique services that you might provide that differentiate you from other providers and things like that. Some things, like I said, as behavior analysts, we kind of really get into is, what your research interests are, who your graduate advisor was, what presentations you made at ABAI or wherever. Those are the things kind of we get into. And so the task at hand here is to really place ourselves in the perspectives of the individuals who are going to be seeking out our services and really find what's motivating to them. And then, try to convey those things in broad terms. There's a cliche in marketing where basically it can be summed up in the following. The things that sell are, you sell benefits and not features of products. And so if we think of behavior analytic services in this regard, the benefits would be the outcomes of our interventions, i.e., more independence, fewer problem behaviors, more skills, more language, etc. The features, however, perhaps are thought to sell less. For example, if we talk about, if we get into the nitty-gritty of different types of instructional strategies or analytic strategies and whatnot, that might resonate with some people who seek our services, but more broadly, they're going to be drawn to the outcomes that we can generate. So always keep in mind the outcomes and or the benefits that are the result of the services we can provide, and use that in your marketing strategies, whether it's on your website or with printed brochures or whatever, and you'll be in a good place. So, anywho, I really hope you enjoyed this experimental episode. If you go to behavioralobservations.com and look for session 15, there'll be a downloadable PDF with all these tips and strategies and things like that on it. So you can check it out there. And also give me some feedback. Let me know what you think about having a kind of non-behavioral topic once in a while on the show. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. So until the next time, thanks for listening to the program. Talk to you guys later.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations Podcast with Matt Sikoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.